Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for joining. This is the last session of 4 sessions of our multifamily homebuyer course. Sarah Lang, I'm with the Brattleboro Development Credit Corporation, although I feel like you all know that because you've been, most of you, if not all of you, have been present for the other sessions. And this last session here is on tenant relations, and hearing from some real live landlords about their experience being landlords and property management. So I'm going to hand it over to Dan Handy and Jeff Dunbar and John Dunbar, and they are going to finish this series off for us. So Dan, why don't you go ahead and take it away?
Okay, I'm going to start with sharing my screen. Hope everybody can see that.
Looks good.
We good? All right. So yeah, well, just by way of introduction, I'm gonna just say a couple words about where we're at with this 4th session, and John and Jeff are going to have a few slides about their landlord experience also. So I hope you're all here for the right event. And by the way, sorry if I have any technical issues, I will try to address them as we go. Okay, so just as a quick overview, we've already covered a lot of introductory issues in the first 3 sessions of this course, and I'm hoping that if you haven't had a chance to participate in those, that you will go back to the recordings. You don't need to have seen those, but it certainly will help. So I'm not going to cover some of, in depth anyway, some of the introductory issues that were covered in those 3 sessions. In addition, so you have our, we've talked about real estate transactions, we talked about some legal and financial concerns, and the rehab projects was in session 3. One of the, well, the next 4 on this list here, which, by the way, can you see my pointer as I'm doing this? Or no, it's this pointer. This pointer? Yes. We good? All right, great. Okay, sorry, using the wrong pointer. So the 4 on the end of this list here, tenant rights, rent control, tenants unions, we're not going to cover in depth. We can take questions about them if you'd like. Property management, we won't go into depth on long and short-term rental issues, but I will mention them. Landlord goals as a practice, as a set of practices in the community. That's a pretty wide issue, but that's basically where we're going with this. And then lessons from the eviction moratorium. I'm sure you might have questions about that. And I will talk a little bit about my experience in the last year and a half or so, but we won't go into too much depth on that. What we will go into really is understanding the relationship between landlords and tenants, basically as a dependent relationship. You might call it codependent, but we can get into that a little bit more. Behaviors which can be by you as the landlord estimated and managed, and then we'll get into tenants and themselves, and the idea that they are essentially individuals and families who are living in the housing that you're providing. And just something that I'm going to spiral back to a little bit every once in a while is, one reason that we're doing this course, obviously, is to encourage people to become multifamily homeowners as individuals, as families, and hopefully all of you are still seriously considering doing that. But it's worth noting that let's say it's somewhere around 42% of all US rental units in the United States are family owned. That means that the other portion is owned by larger and smaller business entities. So we'll talk a little bit about that, but essentially what we're doing by having this course is encouraging individuals and families to buy multifamily homes. That number has to do with the number of overall rental units, but we'll break that apart a little bit. It's also worth noting that 72% of the 2 to 4 unit properties, which I think that's sort of the sweet spot for what anybody here might be considering. 72% of those in the United States are owned by individuals and families. And then last but not least, the main thrust of this whole presentation is that there is a need to maintain tenant relationships. Now, how do you do that? And why do you do that? We're going to touch on a lot of questions related to that, but there is a need, the basic idea being that you actually do need to maintain these relationships. And with that said, let's see. Okay, that's working. If you haven't already, and I'm going to leave it to Sarah to manage the chat box. If you haven't already, if you could put your name, your location, we're going to get to any opinions or ideas that you might have already in the future. So let's hold off on anything additional. But if you could tell us why you're here, essentially in a sentence or a few words. We're basically curious, as I think we asked in the registration phase about what you were interested in, and some folks mentioned that they were interested in owner-occupied situations. Some mentioned investment properties, and some mentioned short-term rentals. All of which we'll kind of start to deal with. Before we get to Jeff and John talking a little bit, I just want to talk about briefly what you're going to call yourself if you own a multifamily property. And this whole idea of being a landlord or a landlady, of course, is rooted in medieval times, the landlord idea. It is the most practical term that we have. And if you don't like it, many folks will use the term housing provider. That's the more modern term, and that's perfectly fine. Although in all of the literature and the legal requirements and so forth, you will be identified as a landlord or a landlady. It is either one of those are better alternatives than an insult that actually comes from Victorian times, which you can look up yourself. It's kind of entertaining. It's in a few pieces of literature, apparently. It was meant as an insult to landlords to call them a mumbling cove. And it does much better in context of sentences. So I invite you to look it up yourself, but it is meant to be an insult specific to a very shabbily dressed, very disgruntled landlord. So you might imagine that image. Of course, none of us are going to be that way, but we know there are lots of insults that people throw at landlords, but we are going to, at least for the sake of this presentation, use the term landlord and landlady, and try to use it in a positive way. Okay, so sorry, I forgot about this slide. Before we get to John and Jeff, I'm just going to introduce what I do very briefly. Essentially, my title is Landlord Liaison, and I'm located at Groundworks Collaborative in Brattleboro. Landlord Liaison is not an entirely transparent term. It basically is one step below mediator, legal mediator in the housing system. And it's not a terribly widely used position in the housing system, but Groundworks and the state of Vermont have been supporting landlord liaisons throughout the state. It is a state supported program, and it's worth noting that there is this larger system within which housing fits. So Groundworks, if you don't know, I will have another slide more about Groundworks at some later. But basically, housing fits into everything that people do every day: food, health, social support networks, and it really isn't a straightforward thing to be a landlord within that system, because you may, as you're relating with tenants, may get questions about all of these things, and it may impact their ability to pay the rent. And we're going to talk about that component of the cash component of the relationship. But the landlord-tenant relationship in general, as I've put up here, it's a contractual relationship, whether a lease is written or not. There are, some people will say, well, I don't have a lease and so forth. Well, there is an implied warranty of habitability that you as a landlord are agreeing to by being under the legal system that supervises housing. And so that's one thing on one side to think about. And on the other side, there are tenant obligations, which are also enforced by law. We aren't going to get into too much of the legal side of this, but it's worth thinking about the fact that this is where people get confused, possibly, or they get more and more involved in the housing system, because when those agreements, whether they're written or not, are breached, then you can, either as a landlord or the tenant, use that breach to legally break the contract of the lease. And so we'll talk a little bit about how that works out, but that's just to give you kind of my overarching idea of what this relationship is all about. So just briefly again, this is basically a description of Groundworks. You may or may not know that we essentially work with families and individuals who are facing housing and food insecurity. And again, because these things, including all the other resources in people's lives, they depend on money. Often we are supplying support for people to address whatever types of risks that are cropping up in their lives. Specifically on my role, I'm basically working as a mediator, essentially, between landlords, property managers, service agencies, and our clients. The idea that I work on essentially is that the relationship between a tenant and a landlord, which is a dyad, two people or two entities, is not very stable. It can be more stable when you have a triad, three or more entities involved, very much like a tripod, right? And we are trying to stabilize people's housing in the community. And that is essentially why we have this position of landlord liaisons. I'm not going to go into these questions too much, but basically we're trying to manage risks and lower barriers for people in the housing system and stabilize these relationships. So here we go. We're gonna, is that showing up on
Yeah, you're editing. Yes.
Yes. I'm dragging a little bit. Okay, here we go. So we're going to talk to John and Jeff now, and they have, I've integrated slides from their presentation so that we can go through this. So you guys, if you'd like to say something before you get to the next slide, just let me know.
I can move right on, I think.
Okay.
So, Jeff and I came into being housing providers as, when we were younger, our parents invested in real estate. They had three young kids, three boys, and they were looking at sort of college expenses and that sort of thing. So they invested in real estate to help with that, and started in the probably mid to late 70s. And over the course of the years had purchased 3 buildings with 7 total units. In 2013, our parents are in their 80s now. And so in 2013, we took over their properties and developed a corporation, Whitaker Properties, Inc., to handle that. And then in 2020, we purchased a 7-unit property. So that is now 14 units. We do manage the properties ourselves, and we do lots of the repairs, updates, rehabs. We've recently gone through a complete gut renovation of 1 unit in 1 building. And we also, in between tenants, if someone moves out, we generally go through and try to do some updates. It's just a whole lot easier that way. So when we can, we do those ourselves. So if any of you guys are interested in what that time commitment is like, or how you get the skills to do that, certainly, don't be afraid to ask. And I put in there that we do have full-time occupations. So, it is, managing 14 units can be different times of year and different circumstances can require a fair amount of time, but then there's also times where things are running pretty smoothly. And but to let you know that you can do this, you can be a housing provider and have a full-time occupation, and certainly the more units you have, the more time it will take to manage those. So next slide. Just wanted to kind of give an overview of our portfolio. We have two bedroom units and 2 buildings that have that. Then we have a 3rd building that is 2 bedroom units, and it has a 1-bedroom cottage. That 1-bedroom cottage is the unit that we did a gut rehab on recently, and utilize some programs that are available to housing providers to help with that as well. And that 7-unit building that we purchased in 2020, that has 5 1-bedroom units, a 2-bedroom unit, and as well as a detached 2-story home that is just a 1-bedroom unit. The first floor is a housing unit right now. So of those 14 units, 8 of them currently receive housing subsidies through VSHA in various programs through Vermont State Housing Authority. So if any of you have questions about that experience as well, we can touch on that.
Great. I wanted to say I was going to mention a few things about rental assistance in this presentation, but I decided to take it out. But certainly if you have questions about VSHA programs or the emergency rental assistance that's been going on during COVID, we can talk about that. Okay. Okay. I'm sorry. Well, I did leave in one piece. Sorry about that. I forgot that I left in a couple pieces about rental assistance, and just as a segue to talking about the key thing, the key contentious issue anyway in a lease agreement or the contract between landlords and tenants, which is the rent itself. And this is basically the conversation the conversation that many landlords and tenants have every month about the cash required to pay the rent, the risks that are involved in the property or in the financial situations that each one landlord and tenant are facing, and then the need that of course the tenant has the need for housing, the landlord has the need for not only the rent to be paid, but for the unit to be taken care of by the tenant. I'm not going to go into this too much, but this is just my way of putting a quote from myself in here. The relationship is essentially this ongoing conversation facilitated by cash, mediated by risk, and driven by need. Okay, so I'm not going to go into this too much again, but I think it's worth mentioning that HUD determines what a cost burdened tenant is, and that it usually generally follows the 30% rule. This is partly to think about how to price a unit, but also to how to have that discussion about increasing rents when you already have a tenant. So the 30% rule is basically the idea that the rent should be generally around 30% of someone's monthly income in order to be considered affordable. Anything over that is not affordable. Other way of looking at that is the person's income should be about 3 times the rent. In order for it to be for the tenant to be considered cost burdened, it also needs to be an imposition where the tenant is at risk of having difficulty affording necessities. So it's not just the income, but that they also have difficulty affording necessities such as food, clothing, transportation, and medical care. This is basically because, of course, someone's income doesn't, they may have a savings account, they may have, personal items that they are willing to sell. So it's not just a matter of the person's income, but really that it's getting in the way of everyday life. Severely cost burdened is considered greater than, or on average about 50% or more, or that their income is only twice the rent. Now here's where we want to get into talking about the effects of cost of housing on the relationship, because it can become the major contentious point. It can have psychological effects on tenants. It can cause anxiety of what they call price anxiety and spatial anxiety over time, and it can essentially make especially the conversation about increasing the rent can make people understandably make people think about their rights as tenants, the ideas of rent control, tenants unions, and all those things can affect the landlord's reputation. We can go into that, but I'm just going to leave it at that. There are some interesting studies about this, but it's worth noting that there really hasn't been very much research into the effects of cost on the landlord-tenant relationship. One of them, though, that has been studied is at the Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies, which is this study, When Do Renters Behave Like Homeowners? High Rent, Price Anxiety, and NIMBYism. Essentially, one of the big effects is that if housing is overpriced, people will not be as willing to have more neighbors, and that includes the building of new housing, as well as the number of people per unit. And so that's a pretty interesting sort of dynamic. It shows up when you're looking at this. I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but I do love showing maps of these types of scenarios. This is one of the bigger concerns, generationally speaking, is the cost burdened generation of the millennials. And these are this is data from 2017, I believe, but it's still fairly current. The generation of 18 to 34-year-olds who are cost burdened. This is a map of the top 10 most cost burdened tenants in the United States by city. And number one is in Honolulu, and there's a few others there. I can give you guys a link to this study, but it's just worth thinking about that this includes gross rent and the utilities and any related costs for housing. I'm not going to go into the specific numbers there, but it gives you kind of an idea of what they're looking at. The finding that millennials are the most cost burdened generation is saying that this number 65.5%, that's 65.5% of millennials are cost burdened, and that's the highest rate of any generation. So this all, and I'm not going to go into all the reasons that generation might be upset about this situation, but it does seem understandable that especially that generation are talking to each other and thinking about all the problems with the housing system. Lena, I'll get to that question. I can see that, but we'll come back to that. Okay. This is often a question that tenants have. Where does the rent go? Now, this is worth thinking about as the landlord, first of all, and you should be able, or at least comfortable, talking about the breakdown of where the rent does go. This is data from a survey. Again, there are very few surveys that are reliable about rents. I mean, it's some of it's based on census data, and some of it's based on, local collection of data at the state level. But this was actually a survey done by the National Apartment Association, which came up with a national number for the United States that says our rents typically go mostly to mortgages, and the owner typically gets, that says 9.1%, let's call it 10% of the rent. And this, of course, is getting back to what Jeff and John were talking about. If you're doing the repairs yourself, then okay, maybe you can say some of that other 10%, that 10.1% for repairs might go to you. Also, if you're doing the maintenance yourself, then some of that maintenance you might be able to do yourself, but so some of that might go to you also. But at any point in doing those repairs, maintenance, any of the tasks that need to be done with a house or a housing unit, there are risks involved, and it is highly recommended that unless you are skilled tradesperson, that you should let repairs be done by a skilled repair person who's also hopefully licensed and can protect you against any accidents that might happen while a repair is being done or while maintenance is being done. Just something to think about. We're going to talk about insurance in a few slides from now, and so that's one thing that in addition to this doesn't have in it those types of costs, but my presumption is that insurance is part of this mortgage payment because many banks pay the insurance for you. So of course, getting back to the discussion of rent, you are going to be talking about cash with people. If someone mentions or talks to you about, if a tenant talks to you about, not being able to pay, it's always a good idea for them to pay what they can pay. And of course, you need to have an accountant involved, hopefully, or someone who's comfortable with accounting, but you want to, of course, keep track of any amounts that they still owe you. But it's always a good idea for you to take at least some partial rent every month. And I'll just leave that at that. Because there's always a need that, let's say someone has an emergency one month and they have to pay for it. It's not a negotiable expense. They can negotiate with you as the landlord. And it is worth negotiating toward getting a portion of the rent. And actually, I think this is a good place for John and Jeff to chime in. Have you guys been in that situation?
Yes, it hasn't come up a lot, but there are occasions where, I'm going to be short. Can I give you, $500 now and I'll have the rest next week? In our ownership, we've been fortunate to only have one eviction. And during that process, it was what we've learned is that once somebody gets behind, it's really hard to catch up. So if they're already strapped and getting behind, at some point you're going to end up, you're going to be fortunate to get out of that hole, and it's probably not going to happen. So having the discussion with them early on, being understanding. I have had the occasion where rather than getting upset, I ask them, when can you pay? If they haven't paid, I go and speak with them, right
Mhm.
off. I don't let it lag. And, it's friendly. It's just, we didn't receive the payment. Did it get lost, etc. And then if they say they aren't able to, I ask them for when it can be paid, when they're sure that they'll have it. And if they tell me that, then I write it down and say, can we agree to this and can you sign this? Because then I have that document that and I don't tell them when it's already past due. I don't tell them the date it's the next payment comes. I let them tell me. So,
Mhm. Mhm.
but we're humans and it's good to be understanding, but it also is you have a contractual agreement and you have financial obligations as they do. And, that's it's hard to do that, being a feeling person, it's sometimes hard to, put your foot down. So, but
Yeah, and I'd reiterate the idea that you don't want, first of all, you don't want them to get in debt, indefinitely, of course, and you want to make a realistic plan with them. And we'll talk about the stage where you're signing the lease and getting the first month's rent and all that. This is certainly one thing to look out for, and especially like in your case, if you've identified that one tenant who has an issue, whether it's forgetfulness, or it could be very innocent, or it could be a real financial strain. Good to be paying attention.
and we have helped them with resources like Southeastern Vermont Community Action, can sometimes help them get through that hurdle. If there's a hardship of some sort, then there are resources to help them. And so we try to facilitate that.
Right.
They're not aware of it.
Right.
It helps
Yeah, exactly.
takes the burden off.
Hmm. Yeah, often tenants don't know that there is support out there for them, so definitely landlord can help out with that. So this is where we get to a little bit of the interactive piece of this. I'm going to hope that this technology works well. I'm going to do a little bit of a poll of you, our participants, using a polling app through this presentation. So let's see if it can work. I'm going to ask you if you have a smartphone, something like this, that you can take a picture of that QR code. It should take you directly through your browser to a website. If that's not possible, you can minimize or make Zoom smaller on your computer and type in the URL for the website itself, and you can participate that way. Or if neither of those work for you, don't worry, you can basically still play along while you're on the Zoom call. But this is just a way for us to get an idea of also what you're interested in, but for us to work up to some of the other topics at the end. So when you log in or when you get to the site, it will ask you for your name. You can put initials or whatever you're comfortable with. Jeff, take care. And let's see. Okay, so the first question that should pop up is your time frame to purchase a multifamily home. Sarah, is that the one that popped up for you still? Okay.
Yep.
Great. All right, so now after you've logged in, it should ask you this question. Sarah, is that working for you?
Yeah, I selected an answer. And
Okay.
it's selected, but it doesn't allow me to go next.
That's right. Yep, that's okay. So apparently we have 7 results. Okay, that's good. And at some point I have to, I'm going to give you a couple of seconds here if you haven't had a chance to log in or respond. Okay. All right, well, I think we're good with 7. And what we're going to see, I think. Okay, good. It took me a second to get that to load, but okay, these are our results. Does everybody see that?
Yep.
Okay, so it looks like everybody, or well, it's a nicely shaped curve here, where let's see, out of our 7, well, it looks like the majority of you are looking into purchasing generally 6 months to a year from now. Good planning on your part. Anyone who's looking any earlier than that, you definitely have your work cut out for you, and certainly understandable if anyone isn't sure how soon they're looking into this, given the current state of the housing market, of course. But that's good to know. Thank you for participating in that. This is lagging a little bit. Okay, here we go. That's our results. Okay. The next question that should pop up in just a second is, have you ever signed a residential lease? And this can be as a landlord or as a tenant. This is a simple yes or no question. It's good to think about the fact that if you have signed one, you've participated in one of these formal relationships. So the question should pop up now. Is that working?
Yeah.
No? Oh, we have some yeses, we have some nos. Jeff, is yours working?
Yes, it is. Yes.
Okay. I've got 7 results. Did it work for everybody? Yeah. Oh, good. Okay, good. All right. So we have 7 results and wow, 100%. Excellent. I think that qualifies all of us as having been part of one of these contracts. Good to know. I hope that when you did sign it, you read the whole thing. And that's not to make a joke of it. I really sincerely mean that. Oop. Okay, now the next question is just a general question about you and your personality. Does everybody see that question?
Mhm.
Okay, so you're going to be able to choose whether you are, as a person, just in general, if you find yourself to be risk averse or risk tolerant, or somewhere in between.
So risk adverse is you don't like risk.
Yes, sorry. Well, yeah, if you are the type of, well, let's see, hard to, if you are opposed to taking any risks in general, of course, we can't always control that, but if you are someone, let's say, who has gone jumping out of airplanes and taking all kinds of personal risks as well as financial risks, you would probably be risk tolerant. And someone who hasn't would probably be risk averse. Okay, so our results, I see. So our results are popping up. I see a lot of the lighter green, some in the one in the middle and one down toward the end. Now, this is not a survey to sort of dissuade you from becoming a landlord, but generally speaking, landlords are probably in the risk tolerant zone because there are risks involved. So we're going to wrap this up with 2 more questions about what makes a good landlord and what makes a good tenant. And I just want you to think about basically personality traits, anything that you might think would make a landlord's experience or relationships indicative of being a good landlord or being a good tenant. And we're going to see that there's a lot of overlap between good landlords and good tenants, but I think it'll be interesting to think about the differences also. If you do find yourself thinking about negative terms, then try to make them positive. That's what I'm trying to get at here. Okay, so the first one is what makes a good landlord. This is going to come up with a word cloud as you answer. And you can answer as many words as you'd like, but try to keep them to 1-word answers or maybe hyphenated words. And I'll give you a couple minutes to do this. I'm hoping everybody can participate in this. Is it working for everybody? Do we have any issues? No? Okay, great. Okay, so respectful is coming up quite a lot. If it's repeated more than once, then it's a bigger word in the word cloud. Any other words? You can answer more than 1 word, by the way. I mean, 1 word at a time is what the instructions are meant to say. But I'll wrap this up in about 10 more seconds. Those are some great responses. I think, basically having, we all have a good sense that a landlord should be honest and respectful. Prompt time is definitely a good thing to be thinking about. Emphatic, not nosy. I like that one. there are some privacy issues for sure with tenant relations. And I'm definitely going to touch on the follow through, the patient and communicative ideas as well. Not nosy. I like that one. That's we'll have to keep that one for later. Oh, by the way, this will be recorded, of course, and but all this is anonymous. I don't even, there's no connection between the name of the individual and the people submitting. Okay, so next, if you look back at your device, is what makes a good tenant? And if you could answer in, give as many one-word answers as you'd like. I'll give you maybe half a minute or so to do this. Great. So there are definitely some similar concerns about timeliness. The behaviors of that would lead to someone not being clean, or vice versa, someone being clean. And I presume you mean cleaning up the apartment and common areas and so forth. It's definitely a concern that's more unique to the tenant. But of course, we still agree that landlords and tenants should be respectful of each other. And we have respect property and respectful, of course, similar idea. Good. But definitely tidy, clean, more concerns about the treatment of the property probably. And, that would indicate a good tenant. Integrity, that's a good one too. I'll leave the pay one off to the side. We'll definitely talk about that also. Okay, so that's the end of the polling, by the way. So if you have a need to close that window or turn off that device, go right ahead. So the next piece is talking about generally what I've broken down into stages of tenant relations. This is just going to talk about a 1-year lease, but of course some tenants will be your tenants for longer than a year. But basically, if we were to break down a 1-year lease, you could break it down into 5 stages. I'm going to use the future as an example, starting in June of 2022. Let's just say you either purchased the property or you, for whatever reason, have a new vacancy in June. And on June 15th, excuse me, the apartment is going to be available on July 1st. But in June, you start planning. And you're going to be posting an ad. You're going to be taking verbal referrals from people if they have heard that you have an available unit coming up. And you're generally going to be screening your tenants either with an application, a form that can, of course, be on paper or email, however you work with applications, or some landlords just work with a one-on-one interview. Whatever works for you, you're going to be the one deciding and planning at that first stage. Now, of course, with the way the scarcity of rental units, I think it wouldn't take more than 2 weeks for you to find a tenant. So if you started on June 15th, you will have by July 1st, you will be preparing quickly to have someone move in. And that before that day or on that day, you will be signing a lease. And basically, as the landlord, of course, you're showing the apartment. Hopefully things go smoothly if you do have someone moving out, and we'll talk about that at the other end of these stages. But there's a lot of activity, of course, right around that preparation for move-in. The third stage is basically, I'm putting it at that first month rent due time, which is, that first month is when you're getting to know your tenant, and you're basically, if you haven't already laid out ground rules while you're leasing up, then you are probably observing behaviors and you're trying to reinforce ground rules with clear communication. The time when the first month's rent is due is also a great time, the week before that or the day that it's due. Also, of course, a good time to get to know the tenant a little bit better. Stage 4 is just about 6 months into the tenancy. At some point around there, you should definitely be assessing what behaviors you're noticing, any risks that you have observed, and any issues. And that's basically the time when you should be doing a unit inspection, an inspection of the apartment or the house. And if you do have an agreement that involves them paying utilities, you want to still address any concerns about utilities, even if you're paying, even if they're paying for them, or if you're paying for them. Either way, it's a good thing to pay attention to. And of course, upkeep issues. So as was mentioned earlier, cleanliness, anything that you might see as an issue that for the next 6 months, you're still planning for the next 6 months to be continuing to reinforce the ground rules that you've set. And at the end of the year, you're going to be, not just at the very end of the lease, but in that last month or even a little bit before that, you're going to be deciding whether to renew the lease. The tenant is also going to be deciding whether they need to renew the lease or move out. And there is going to be the issue of last month's rent. And typically, at the leasing up stage, many landlords take first and last month's rent and a security deposit. The security deposit, as we'll just touch on briefly in a minute, really is can be the contentious part of this decision as far as paying for damages are concerned. At the same time, you're going to, if let's say the tenant is moving out, you're going to be concerned with possibly providing landlord references for your current tenant for their next landlord. So so there's always that interplay at the beginning and the end of this process. And this is why at that first stage, stage 1, you're really you're setting out the nature of the relationship throughout that whole lease, because you're constantly planning, but you've already screened the tenant at the very beginning, right? Your, for lack of a better word, your risk management process really needs to start with screening. And this is not to say that any screening process is foolproof, because of course people change, and things happen in people's lives. But that is really the starting point, of course. This is just a list of good advice, for you as the landlord. Of course, you want to keep the common areas clean. Those are like hallways and entranceways. If there is snow involved, of course, then you need to be thinking about that. Communicating effectively all the way through. When issues about repairs or maintenance issues come up, it's good to resolve them quickly. It's also good to explain what is going on with it, because sometimes it's not in your control when something's going to be repaired. And you just want to communicate clearly that you are working on the problem if there is one. This idea of keeping your promises, keep your word, of course, is important. Being clear in writing just follows from the lease, and that's just a good process always to follow. And when you're leasing up, this is just a little piece of advice that I think is a good idea. Landlords often do give their tenants gifts in more ways than one. It might not just be, a physical gift. It might be the gift of, shoveling the snow for them, or doing any sort of task around the house. Those sorts of things are always appreciated. But just to reiterate about this first stage, during that stage, you often are going to be screening a new tenant, and you might be providing references for your outgoing tenant. So just good to be thinking about that. It's a busy time. And at the lease up time, it's a good practice to actually write down, especially if you have, in John and Jeff's case, if you have 14 tenants, good idea to write down short-term and long-term goals for any tenant, even if they are just, ideas at the time. You might revisit those later if they're in writing. And in general, of course, anything that involves a date should be put in writing and sent to the tenant. That's good practice. I'm just going to briefly touch on a couple of property management considerations, but before we do that, I just wanted to take a check, Sarah, at the chat.
Nothing in the chat, but if anyone has any follow-up questions or clarifications, feel free to unmute. Yep. And ask.
Yeah, we'll definitely we'll cover more questions in general later. There was a question earlier. Right, the income information. I think I'll try to get to that at the end. Revisit that. But yeah, if there aren't any other questions in the chat, I'll just cover a couple of issues with property managers. So as the property owner or the housing provider, the landlord, you can hire a property manager. And this came up at the last session, session 3. Property manager is someone who you are essentially hiring. And great question. We'll store that one away for later. We'll talk about rent as well. A property manager, on that note, may help you with that kind of determination of how much to rent the property for. They may have more experience than you. They may have specific experience with the type of property that you're renting. And so they can be a really good source of not only information, but professional practice that they've possibly been doing it for many years and seen all kinds of different scenarios. One of the major ones, or actually two major areas that property managers are active in, is basically enforcing decisions around habitability. And this is where it starts to get a little bit technical. And this is where you might really, if you don't feel comfortable, not only with the tenant relations side, but also with actually the legal side, then it might be worth it to you to hire a property manager. They are responsible, or they should be involved in deciding whether to escalate or de-escalate situations, essentially. Now, that can include anything concerning the landlord's or the tenant's responsibilities, repair issues, the actual amount of the rent and when it's paid, or any retaliation issues. Now, these 4 issues are all covered under habitability laws in Vermont. The dispute resolution issues that can come up with or without a property manager generally follow a system of escalation. Like I mentioned earlier, as a landlord liaison, I'm somewhere under here or at the very early stage of dispute resolution under a professional mediator, which is basically a lawyer's task they can provide. And, you know, dispute resolution can be a wide range of things, of course, but it can involve going to court and dealing with financial institutions. Because of this, the property manager needs to have good skills with communicating not only the content of what the situation is, because they're going to be telling, you know, the lawyer or the judge what the situation is in some cases, but they also need to be good at analyzing the context of what's going on. Just to give you kind of the scenario here, you're going to know what type of dwelling you particularly own, but a property manager will know a variety of comparisons with different dwelling types. And I think I'll just leave it at there. But basically, for example, there's a big difference between mobile homes, for example, and apartments. The requirements under habitable housing, again, are fairly detailed, and they all lead in the direction of basically health and safety inspections and turning over the unit to another tenant if they go to the extreme of what you could be doing in housing court, for example, eviction. These are just some resources for, this was touched on in the legal section. These links will be provided to you. Again, it's all fairly detailed by state statute. It's good to remember that the health codes and all agency guidance are fair game when you get to the point of needing to regulate the landlord-tenant relationship. Essentially, once you have either decided to, let's say, go to court, or for some reason you're forced to go to court, the relationship is then being regulated by the state. And I'm just going to touch on a couple of things about what you allow tenants to do in a property. There are, of course, a wide variety of them, but again, a property manager would know all the ins and outs of these issues. One of them, one big question is, what is written into the lease and what is unwritten? Okay. If you do allow pets, and there are issues, of course, around pets, that should be written into the lease. The typical guest policy for tenants to allow visitors is 14 days in a 6-month period. So that's not consecutive days. It can also be written as 7 consecutive days. You can imagine the reasons for having limitations on that and being very clear about it. An extreme version of a guest policy would be if you are allowing the tenant to sublet, you should write that into the lease. And there are other guidances provided by the state, of course, about what should be written into the lease. But those are some of the big ones right there. The unwritten, sort of common sense, if you will, things are, besides the risks and needs involved, obviously destruction of property, obviously, if you're getting stories that are not essentially true, it's my polite way of putting it, non-fragmented stories, it's it's up to you to be judging, of course, along the way at any stage in the relationship, but you are going to be using that information if you need to escalate the relationship where it's even going to be beyond your control. And we'll talk about that in a second. But of course, there are a wide variety of scenarios. The unwritten pieces also are what are considered reasonable accommodations. So if there's no reason other than you don't like the idea, that's probably not a good reason to not accommodate or not allow something. Just to keep that in mind. And many tenants are transportation dependent, meaning that whether they have a car or not, let's say they have a parking issue, or if they don't have a car, they need to be on public transportation for whatever reason. There are transportation related issues that are unwritten, but might come up in the relationship. And this idea, this at any stage, these issues could come up. It applies to all the tenant obligations, whether it's a long or short-term tenancy, and whether or not things change with the tenant. Now, of course, that could include financial changes. It could include family changes, friends. All these sorts of things come up at any stage in the relationship. Okay. And I'm going to try to wrap up within, well, definitely before 7 for sure, but let's see how quickly we can get through this. So I want to leave time for questions for sure. This is a slide I put together to kind of just give the overall picture of the network that landlords and tenants are working within, that relationship exists within. Of course, the landlord-tenant relationship is in the middle. Okay, each one of these nets or these dots on the screen is going to represent a net, which could become part of the network depending on the given scenarios. So we start with the landlord-tenant relationship. One of the first immediate or emergency nets that you may need to contact are the police or sheriff's department, or the fire department and emergency medical. These issues do come up as emergency issues. You need to be prepared to do that, and it's not a bad idea. Of course, if you've already had relations with any of these departments, then you may want to ask questions before you go ahead with an emergency call of some sort, but it certainly is part of the support network in any town. Beyond that, you do have your state excuse me, state housing court or lawyers. And one of the things that, of course, if you have a fire, of course, or some medical emergencies, it can affect your property valuation, and that is a larger issue, of course, but something to certainly keep in mind, that's part of the network around this relationship. But these are the emergency things, but on an everyday level, and just as a matter of doing business, you're going to be working with construction professionals and town and city inspectors. Now, this is important because tenants are often the person who, well, they might be directly in touch with the construction person. They may also, let's say if things are escalated around a repair, they may threaten to call some sort of town inspector or something like that, and that's certainly within their rights. But it's, of course, also going to become an issue that you get a chance to discuss with them. This layer of nets is then sort of beyond the everyday nature of things, with your local social services or housing agencies. You may need to also be talking to financial institutions. It might not just be your bank, but the tenant's bank also. And then, as I mentioned earlier, property managers and real estate professionals can be really helpful in helping to negotiate a lot of the issues that might come up. And last but not least, this is the last set of dots, I assure you. You have a range of other resources or nets outside of the relationship. The actual state housing agencies, as mentioned before, the Vermont State Housing Authority and the Vermont Housing Finance Agency, are two state housing agencies that you might want to get in touch with. There are concerns around insurance companies, and I didn't mention this intentionally at the beginning, but at the stage of leasing, you want to talk to your tenant about possibly getting renter's insurance. You, of course, also need property insurance for yourself. The renter's insurance is called HO4, that's why that's in there. And then, of course, there are all sorts of resources on the internet for DIY solutions. However, you, as I mentioned earlier, you do want to get professional assistance if you can possibly. So about that renter's insurance question, this is just a brief overview, but of course you need landlord's insurance. It's also called public liability insurance. It's required by your lender usually if you do have a mortgage. And it's good to remember that roommates or other varieties of tenants can have their own individual policies which interact with yours. The tenant getting renter's insurance is really a good conversation to have. You cannot require it in your lease, okay? Excuse me, you can require it in a lease, but it's not enforceable in the sense that the state doesn't require the tenant to get renter's insurance. But if you have had that discussion, you have essentially offered the tenant a fair warning. And if you do want to get into that conversation a little bit more in detail, it's worth talking about what are called the 16 perils, which sounds like a great movie title, but it's actually a thing in insurance policies. And they include everything, of course, from fire to explosions to aircraft crashing into the building. Number 9 is theft, which I'm going to talk about. But these are real hazards or perils or risks in our everyday lives, and it is worth talking about with your tenant, especially depending on the location of your rental property. A lot of interesting possibilities to talk about. The most common one that people think about with renter's insurance is theft, and that's number 9 on the list there. If you use the replacement cost calculation that typically is used by insurance companies, you're using this little calculation here. It's the replacement value times the difference between the expected life of the item minus the current life of the item, C, okay, and divided by the expected life of the item. So in this case, a 2-year-old laptop, okay, for example, which replacement cost actually would be $1,200. Well, it's a 2-year-old laptop, so it's not $1,200 because you multiply it times 3, the difference between the expected value and the current value, because it's 2 years old. You get that that product, and you divide it by 5, which is again the expected overall life of the item, and you get $720. So an insurance company would pay off on a 2-year-old laptop. Typically, this is with these numbers, of course, but typically at $720. And if, depending on the rate that the insurance company charges, that could be worth it to the renter just with that one coverage. Okay, this one I hastened, or I hesitated to put this in there, but I do want to talk about worst case scenarios if anybody has questions about them. And this is one of the worst ones that I have come across. This is a quick story, and I will read it, about a tenant who over the course of 20 months essentially destroyed an entire apartment. And this is, I know that this can be this alarmist, and I'm not trying to discourage anyone, but this is reality of what kind of damage can be done. So again, this is an actual case, and I won't answer any questions about specifics, but it was during the pandemic, or well, it started before the pandemic and ended during the pandemic. And it's worth, appreciating that a lot of people were under stress during this time. But this is one example of where it went a little too far. So this unit was furnished with bureaus and 2 couches, 2 chairs, and a full-size bed. The bed and the couches and all the bed and the couches and the chairs, sorry, I need my glasses, all had to be taken to the dump. So this is when the unit has been vacated in November of 2020. The pictures, which I have, I'm sparing you looking at the pictures, by the way, but I have pictures of this. The pictures don't do justice to the stench, which unfortunately is another reality of these situations. The furniture all had blood stains, urine stains, and food stains. The carpet in the bedroom had to be ripped up, and the carpet was an off-white when they moved in. The pictures that I've seen do show blood splatter from when the tenants I should say this may not have entirely been the tenants, but we don't know that. However, it was their responsibility. Someone in the unit was shooting up, and they did it wrong. While they were there, they had a dog, but the dog died, and the landlord unfortunately found it in a suitcase in the carport. So that is probably, hopefully, the worst that you could possibly ever expect, other than, of course, catastrophe of all sorts. But in a typical turnover of an apartment, hopefully the worst that we would ever expect to see. Okay, so to wrap up really quickly, you're going to have to develop your own list of goals as a landlord, landlady, or for your family. And it's worth noting that often it is a family decision when you are owning properties, as John and Jeff made a perfect example of. And so you need to be ready to discuss these things, setting goals with your family. But essentially, these are 4, things that you can learn in what you could call a community of practice, learning from other landlords in your community. If you are, attempting to meet investment targets, that's one possible goal. Or if you have, if it's an owner-occupied situation, that's going to have certain goals accompanying it. If you're number two, if you're developing your own community service skills, I didn't emphasize this earlier, but if you want to consider a landlord a community service provider, that's another role that you are definitely engaging in some way by providing housing. And you're developing, through doing this, you're developing professional judgment for sure. And number three, if you're maintaining a reputation in the community, or good client relationships, you might see this as a matter of not only the proof being that you've maintained a good relationship of your good landlord status, but also that you are providing this this sort of product to a customer in the community. Again, that varies with what kind of property you're actually providing. And number four, just in general, you may have a goal, especially if you are rehabbing housing, of providing safe housing for tenants in their life's journey, let's say, of self-actualization, because it's worth remembering that people have things happen in their lives, and it's going to affect their relationship with you as the landlord. And with that, we'll go to questions and concerns.
That was really great.
Sure. This is just a quote, by the way, just to open up the conversation. I know we don't have very much time, but we have a few minutes. And I added a couple of fun images just to lighten the load here a little bit. But screening is not only a process that you go through when you're screening tenants, but of course, screens and windows. And I thought these were amusing. These are, just to give credit, these are both a window screen company in Sacramento, California, that have them on their website, of a cat on this ripping the screen, and a hole big enough for a praying mantis to fly through. So if you do have any questions, I'm open to either chat questions or anybody unmuting themselves.
I'd like to just follow up with a comment. So anybody's welcome to reach out to me at any point. I absolutely love what I do. If I could do this full time, I would. It's not, 14 units does not provide an income to where that's providing a livelihood. But it is, I had a mentor who said to me, if it's not fun, don't do it. And I always think about that. Not every day is fun. There are days that are stressful, but for the most part, with 14 tenants, I have really good relationships with these people, and they do bring something to my life that I really value, and without that, would be a different person. So if you have questions about the whole process, or somebody asked about establishing effective rents and things like that, I'm totally available. My email, which I can put in the chat, I'll provide you that. Is that cool, Sarah? Is that, I don't know.
Yeah, and I'll send tomorrow or later, I'll send the recording and the PowerPoint, and I'll include Dan and Jeff and John's email in that, so people will.
Yeah, I'll let you handle that then. But yeah, so please feel free to reach out. And Dan, thanks for, it was great.
Any other questions? I mean, we do have a few minutes, so please feel free to unmute yourself or type in the chat.
Hi, Susan. Thank you for attending.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Jeff. And thank John for us too.
Will do.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great evening, and really appreciate you attending this series.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.